I may not perform. I think I've been using the method to prepare for this though, because I'm absolutely so tired. I'm sort of blind and don't know what I'm doing anymore, and kind of not really sure where I am. But that may help with these plays, which I suppose I've got to warn you up front are tragedies. It's a Sunday, and we're going to discuss Kierkegaard later on. Maybe a bit of doom and gloom in today, but I think we're going to have to bear with that. There are a couple of jokes involved. I also want people to bear in mind some of the things we've been discussing through the Luther Kant sessions, and also forward to Kierkegaard and Sartre, in terms of some of the questions that have been coming up about the internal self, interiority, and what happens when it tries to act on the external world, or the external world acts on it. It runs up against obstacles and necessity. Questions of freedom and obedience, which I think are pretty clear in Antiquity, for example, and how do we see those working out in Greek thought at the time, which I suppose is also the possibility of resistance and rebellion. So we had the questions, or the possibility, the yearning for freedom that Luther introduced into the world, which also became a site of resistance. And we didn't really touch on the lecture of Kant yesterday, but if you take something like the French Revolution, which is a law-breaking activity, so not a kind of good Kantian moral, but Kant was, pretty congratulatory about the French Revolution after the event. He was prepared to say, well, I think that was a good thing. As the guy said, it might be too early to tell, but he allowed, the backwards validations and law breaking. So that happens as well in some of these plays. And in terms of Kierkegaard, there's the question of faith and reason. How much can we accomplish by reason? How much, as we touched on yesterday with Iliad, how much is down to our passions, and not just the anger in our shaggy breasts of heroes, but also the compassion, which we see certain elements of. We didn't touch yesterday on the end of the Iliad. It was a very moving scene where Achilles raises Priam, father of dead Hector, from his knees, and it gives in, repents, if you like, and says, I'm really sorry about Hector and the piercing, we're both men. But it ends on that note of compassion in a way that Oedipus at Colonus also ends on a note of compassion, but Theseus extends to the aged blind man going to his death. So those are some of the themes I want to talk about. One sort of admission up front is that although I'm going to try, I don't think it's actually possible to know what Greek audiences really made of these plays. I don't think you can just simply read through them and say, this is Sophocles, what he meant, and this is what they understood, and wrap it all up and say that's what the play is about. These are great works of literature, and pretty much everything's in here. You can read them today and you think, I recognise these themes. So you have to, whenever you're reading literature, come at it with a series of assumptions, if you like, an approach, try and grab hold of something in it and get somewhere. I'm coming at it a bit, trying out from an existentialist reading, if you like, of these plays, in terms of the problematization of being free in the world. Hopefully that's not too much of an act of violence on these plays, because I think they back that up, but I would say that, wouldn't I? We'll see as we go through. A couple of thoughts I had while I was writing these lectures. I was smoking quite a lot writing them, and sometimes when you're looking at words in front of you and they just don't swim into view, and then finally they do, and the inside of this packet of tobacco it said, choose freedom. I thought, no, they must have got that wrong. That should say choose death. It's clearly what I'm doing. So look at it again. It said choose freedom, we're here to help you. I thought that was a peculiar thing. I didn't know if that would work out in ancient Athens. And then the second thing I thought was, when I was 16, in 1984, there were a number of things that had big impacts on me at the time. The miners' strike, for one, the IRA trying to blow up Thatcher in the Brighton hotel bombing, Ronald Reagan joking that he was going to press the button and destroy Soviet Union in the next 5 minutes of nuclear annihilation. And it seemed to me that the world was being shaken up, or might be radically shaken up in lots of ways. But not much more than 10 years later, the British Labour movement was finished, the IRA was finished, and the Soviet Union had broken up. So, things happen, and some things don't last very long. When Sophocles was 16 in 480 BC, he was probably evacuated from Athens as the Persians under Xerxes invaded, as you'll know from tomorrow. Sophocles may have watched the Persian fleet even being smashed by the Greek triremes at the Battle of Salamis. And he came back to an Athens that had been burnt to the ground by the Persians, the Acropolis smoking in the background. Tradition has it that he was chosen, because he had a good singing voice and shapely thighs, chosen to lead the victory chant, Paean to freedom, that was sung after the victory at Salamis. And he went on through his very long life to become the leading tragic playwright of 5th century Athens. He wrote about 123 plays, and we've only got about 7 of them left. He won the annual city theatre competition, which is where these plays were performed, the Dionysia. He won it 24 times out of 30 attempts, which is not bad going. He was also, as one of the beautiful and the good, a wealthy, well-educated Athenian gentleman. He played his fair share, his elected role in the public affairs at the time. He was a treasurer of the Athenian Delian League, he was a general, a councillor, and a cult priest. So he lived through that period of the kind of greatness of Athenian democracy and empire, the 50 years or so of the Pentaconta Aetia, from Salamis to the start of the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. Years that were full of art and argument, science and philosophy, sophists and Socrates debating everything, every which way they could. Prosperity, time of pleasure, Protagoras declaring that man was the measure of all things. But a brief moment of democracy and freedom at the beginning of Europe, I suppose. And when the Antigone was staged in 442, 441 BC, the Parthenon, or as they called it then simply, the temple, sort of the greatest war memorial ever built, was about halfway to completion in the background of the staging of the play. This is the great age of Pericles. Although, in that same year, the crushing of the revolt of the island of Samos from the Athenian-dominated Delian League, a sort of anti-Persian defense league, if you like, meant the war with Sparta was probably inevitable. So why did this man, Sophocles, who had everything going for him, if you like, write these plays about the mythical story of the doomed family of Oedipus? Stories of plague, incest, blinding, war, death, the relentless focus on our mortality and the futility of man, the cruelty or indifference of God. And what was the impact on him of the political and intellectual climate he was involved in and played his part in shaping? And what did the audience of some 15,000 on the makeshift theatre make of these plays? Can you explain them in the light of what was actually going on at the time? So is Antigone's act of rebellion against the tyrant Creon in some way prefiguring or reflecting the revolts that were happening against the increasingly harsh imperialism, if you like, of Athens? Is the Oedipus Tyrannos of 429 BC, which is the year Pericles dies, in an Athens actually ravaged by a real plague which killed about 25% of the population? Is that play not obviously addressing the horrors of that real event brought upon Athens by its war with Sparta and trying to ask what's gone wrong? And the last act of Sophocles' life, the posthumous performance in 401 BC of the Oedipus at Colonus, with its kind of incredible and poignant beauty, the Attic countryside around Athens laid waste by Spartan and Theban raids, and the way it predicts a greatness of Athens in the future when Athens had just crashed to defeat in a bloody civil war. What does that tell us about how Athens understood itself at the time? More insights can we gain into how freedom and necessity were understood intellectually and through the experience of that city, and Sophocles himself was a witness to that all, 5th century pretty much. But it's very easy to try and make a neat reading off. This play means that because this was happening at the same time. In history, it doesn't work on many levels. Aeschylus produced an Oedipus trilogy in 467 BC, some 20 years before the Antigone. Oedipus is referred to in the Iliad, so those mythical figures like Oedipus and Theseus are before the Iliad. So in the 5th century, playwrights are reaching even further back into history, looking behind them to try and explain where they are now. That's something that's going on irrelevant to the realities of a plague in 429 BC. After all, there's a plague in the Antigone as well, which results from Creon's refusal of burial to Polynices, which happens long before the real one, and a plague, of course, kickstarts the action in the Iliad. It all starts to go wrong because Achilles tries to find out what the cause of all of this plague is, exactly the same way that Oedipus tries to find out what the cause of this plague in Thebes is. So, straightforward historical reasons readings don't work that easily, but my basic thesis on this, to get us started, is that the 3 Theban plays explore and reflect the condition of being human, of existing in Athens, a city in which everything was possible and much was attempted, but at the same time nothing was certain. Every outcome was unpredictable, and every attempt to express freedom, to act in the world, ran up against the problem of order, and every attempt to impose order broke up on the freedom of others. Jacob Burckhardt in the 19th century may or may not have been right to say that Greek philosophy never really came to grips with the question of freedom and necessity in human behavior. But he was surely right, I think, to say that Greek art, flowering like the Renaissance, asks us over and over again, how did this pure blossom of the spirit arise? How did freedom assert itself amid order, or order amid freedom? Now, for those of you who were here last year, Frank gave a lecture on Greek politics, and I might just rehearse some of the points he made in that Athens at the time was a very defiant and risk-taking, pragmatic culture, prided itself on its rationality, and didn't feel itself banned or shackled by tradition and custom. So Oedipus's intelligence, taking flight and hitting its mark in his proud solution to the generational riddle posed by the Sphinx, the answer is man, I'm the answer, is an example. Risk-taking to the extent of being prepared to abandon Athens and its security for the supposed but risky freedom of the seas, being prepared to trust an untested navy that they built 3 years before against the might of the Persian Empire. Or even people's willingness to deny the truth of divine prophecy, which happens throughout these plays. I think maybe the very stress that's put on prophecy, and we get some of this in Herodotus as well, on the ability to speak the truth about the future is actually testament to a feeling that the future is out of control. Prophecy is predicated on the absence of a divine order, I think, and not the evidence of any underlying supernatural necessity. What always goes on is man asks questions, goes up to Delphi, what's going to happen, some riddles come back in the mouths of other men, and we're just left with a decision to make. Athens knew that every democratic decision taken by the authority of the assembly of citizens meant that every decision was equal to any other. Nothing lasted or was permanent. Count no man happy until he dies, free of pain at last. It was a society of very sophisticated rationality. We see Creon's arguments in the Oedipus Tyrannos that he can't be a traitor because there's nothing in it for me, is there? I've already got power by being behind the throne, so why on earth would I want to be on it? You've got nothing to fear from me. I wouldn't want the stress of being you, Oedipus. Or again, in Oedipus at Colonus, we hear the argument, which was a stock in trade of the sophists, that the weak can defeat the strong. It was a culture that had contestation built into its very heart. The Olympics, of course, we can think of, but these performances of tragedy too were a contest that happened every year. Contest and disputation were a matter of entertainment for Athenian citizens. A culture that I think was aware of the dangers of excess, including excessive freedom, of the dangers of going beyond, dangers that were inherent in everything that they attempted to do, because the only order that existed in that society, the only limits, were those of a relatively short-lived democratic consensus. And a world in which fortune is fickle, as the messenger in Antigone tells us, announcing the death of Priam's son, Haemon. There's not a thing in this mortal life of ours I'd praise or blame as settled once for all. Chance lifts and chance fells the lucky and unlucky every day. No prophet on earth can tell a man his fate. Tiresias, echoing Shakespeare, says all men make mistakes, it is only human. In this world, sacred authority was not beyond question or didn't exist. Even the existence of the gods was up for debate and skepticism. Jocasta claims it's all just chance. There is no authority that can put anything off limits, no stable hierarchies, and no institutional permanence. No state, in fact. No body of armed men, no law courts in any sense we understand. Plays like Aeschylus's Oresteia, that trilogy, actually attempt to invent institutions, like the cult of the Eumenides, turning the Furies into the kindly ones by building them an institution. They're trying to invent these things on the fly, through the very celebration of contestation. But that is inevitably a doomed venture, I think. You can't just vote social cohesion and order into existence. So in short, I would read these plays as dramatizing the instability inherent in Athenian democracy, its inability to find any firm underpinning for itself, any lasting order, only really able to express ideas about right and wrong through debate and argument, through politics, in other words, where nothing gets handed down by tradition, but tradition is always questioned. Nothing is permanent. There's a continual contest within the city, the polis, between free and equal citizens who are irreverent to each other, make free with each other. And there's continual warfare outside the polis with other free and equal city-states. And this can become an exhausting and destabilizing process. Although it is a culture of freedom, it's a culture of instability at the same time. And this story of Oedipus, whose one moment is happily married, albeit to his mother, but he is happily married nonetheless. The chorus tells us at one point that the joy of Oedipus and Jocasta was deep joy indeed. But now in this one day, wailing, madness and doom, death, disgrace, all the griefs in the world that you can name are all theirs forever. So overnight, what appears to be a conventional and a happy marriage, and you just think, why not carry on? You're doing all right. It suddenly turns into the worst crime imaginable, because Oedipus has found out that he is not whom he thought he was, that beneath his freedom, his unrestrained freedom as a tyrant, the article by Saxonhouse, I felt, was quite useful in talking about the way you can think about the absolute freedom of a tyrant who is illegitimate. He takes power, he's a self-made man. Thought that was useful background to this. But his freedom as a tyrant is actually his unholy nature. We can see custom and law, which the word for that in Greek is nomos. We're going to talk about them at great length tomorrow. The rule of law gets undercut by nature, physis. And this is one of the key intellectual insights of the period, that there is a difference between nomos and physis. It's one of the key debates of the 5th century thought. Leading even philosophers like Xenophanes, who wondered that man surely just creates God in his own image, doesn't he? He says, if oxen and horses or lions had hands, or could draw with their hands, horses would have drawn horse-like gods. And Thracians would have drawn gods with blue eyes and red hair, and Ethiopians would have drawn black gods, and so on. We just make them up. So conventions at this time were easily seen to be just that, conventions all that appears solid melts into air, into nothing. But so these are dramas as well as the overstepping of limits, the transgression of necessity, external obstacles by man's freedom, in which characters often display hubris, excessive pride, defiance, lawlessness, and they become hyper. They stand above, which is what hyper means, of course, in Greek, to be over and above, but also that which goes over and beyond. They're excessive characters. Oedipus is a tyrant, he's proud and haughty, but it is his actions which are excessive and transgress limits. He killed his father and married his mother. And he becomes sort of a hyper-maniacal, demonic, that word that we heard yesterday, daimonos is mentioned quite a lot. His search for his own truth, despite everybody advising him, just leave it, Oedipus, you don't look, no, he has to, he's driven, necessitated to find out the truth about himself. Similarly, Ismene, Antigone's sister, tells her the same sort of thing. Know your place, don't fight with men, don't submit to those in power, right at the very beginning of the Antigone. Think, Ismene says, what a death will die, the worst of all, if we violate the laws and override the tyrant's fixed decree, his power. We must be sensible. Remember, we are women. We're not born to contend with men. Then too, we're underlings, ruled by much stronger hands, so we must submit in this, and in things still worse. Whatever that may be. Do as you like, says her sister. I will act alone. Antigone would rather make a project out of death than give way. She's fiercely equal despite being a woman, as equal as any Athenian citizen felt to another. In the absence of any solid authority at this time, I think it's no surprise that you can see Tiresias, the prophet, rounding on Oedipus in the Tyrannos. You may be the tyrant, but I have a polity, at least, you're equal to contradict you. In this I have power too. I do not live as your slave. Or Creon and Oedipus can make the following exchange. Creon, what if you bring everything to nothing? No matter, I must rule, says Oedipus. Not if you rule unjustly. Listen to him. Thebes is my city. Creon replies, mine too, not yours alone. A squabble, actually, here's one of the jokes, as it happens, but at that point, when they're having this standoff and they only get half a line each of the play, Jocasta, mummy, turns up to put a stop to this squabble, and she tells her boy/husband off for disturbing the peace with private quarrels. And he sends them both off home to bed. She says, Oedipus, into the palace now, and Creon, you go home. Why all this big fuss over nothing? But the word she uses for the quarrel is stasis, which is a fascinating word in Greek. Literally it means where you stand, your position. But thus, your position in relation to another at the same time, like a boxer, or a defendant in court. By extension, again, a group or a party, a faction, and thus to an abstract meaning of dispute, dissent, and discord. And stasis was the ongoing process of civil strife in Greek city-states, whereby one wealthy aristocrat would force himself into power, become a tyrant, provoke a new faction who would throw him out, and the cycle would continue until Athens, this sort of miracle of democracy, put a stop to that. Cleisthenes, big democratic reformer, took an unprecedented and probably desperate step of enlisting the common people on his side in one of these struggles, which sort of let the democratic cat out of the bag, and once people had a sniff of power, if you like, there was no going back. Stasis is what we see in the civil war of Eteocles and Polynices, the two brothers. We see it in the standoff between Antigone and Creon. Page was luckily outnumbered them. There's a whole question of exactly by what authority Oedipus does rule Thebes, the city that he saved, but polluted through not being born, in the sense that he has become his own father, a thoroughly unnatural, self-created creation. Stasis exists Two, in the conflict between generations, where each generation is not able to free the next, we're told in one of the plays, and the young rebel against the authority of their elders and their betters, rejecting the wisdom of Tiresias, mocking the laws of the gods. There's an ongoing conflict between the generations that became increasingly intense through Athens' war with Sparta, where the young blamed their defeat on the incompetence of their fathers, and the fathers in turn blamed the recklessness of golden youths like Alcibiades and his doomed Sicilian expedition. Creon in the play is cast as being young, at least in terms of his wisdom, if not his physical age. When he assumes the tyrant's powers, he says, "You cannot know a man's character, a ruler, until he has shown his colours ruling the people. Experience is the test," he asserts. But it's precisely experience he lacks, as we see almost immediately when his made-up laws bring ruin on his own family. We hear in the Tyrannos of generations strewn on the ground, unburied, unwept, the dead spreading death. And later the generations of men, like the dying generations, adding the total of all your lives, I find they come to nothing. Oedipus is somebody who's cropped the very roots of his existence. And think of the terrifying curse that Oedipus hurls at his own sons at the end of the Colonus. "You will learn, at last, to respect your parents. I'll teach you to heap contempt upon your father. My curses have you in their power now. You die! Die and be damned! I spit on you! Out! Die! Die by your own blood brother's hand! Die! So I curse your life out." Thanks, Dad. And if you've got any doubts about the reality of this intergenerational conflict, you can read in the Platonic dialogue Euthyphro, where Socrates is on the way to court for the charge of corrupting the young. He runs into a man called Euthyphro, who's going to the magistrate's court to prosecute his father for the manslaughter of a slave who had murdered another slave. Euthyphro doesn't care that it's an act of impiety to prosecute his father. He says, "Well, look what Zeus did. He castrated his dad. There shouldn't be one law for men and one law for gods. It's quite all right for me to prosecute my dad." And all these characters who are hyper, excessive, these excessive characters who are hyper and beyond, they end up hypo, below the ground. Although in the case of Oedipus, at least, I think we can see that there's a possibility expressed that something good might come out of this cycle of defiance and death. Okay, I'm going to try and speed up a little bit, but there is quite a lot to get through in terms of these plays, but I want to touch on each of them. The Antigone is a very famous reading of it by Hegel, who argues that the tragic hero reconciles through death competing moral claims, not between good and evil, but between two excessive versions of the same of the good. So Antigone's religious conscience, which leads her to try and bury her dead brother, comes into opposition with Creon's state law, that the enemies of the state should not be buried. Hegel would argue that through her death and the disintegration of Creon's family, we somehow, in the end, see a reconciliation of ethical thesis and antithesis. In the greater synthesis may be expressed by the final words of the chorus in that play, which ends, "By far good sense is the first part of good fortune. One must not be irreverent to the gods. Mighty words of the overproud, paid back in full with mighty blows of fate, teach good sense in old age." So Hegel doesn't agree with Aristotle, who theorized in his Poetics that the tragic hero should not be an extreme of good, but a mixture of both good and evil. In his Poetics, which he really develops through reading Oedipus Tyrannos, he argues that tragedy acts as a purge, a corrective on an excessive emotion and passion in the audience, through them feeling fear and pity for a tragic figure doomed by what he calls hamartia. Not actually a tragic flaw, which is sometimes translated as, but a state of moral ignorance, blindness, where you act without knowledge. So Aristotle says that acting is acting without knowledge of the outcome. Acting, in other words. we're never sure of an outcome. We can do nothing else. So in this sense, Aristotle tells us that Greek tragedies, Greek drama are about acting. Now, I don't mean to ridicule it by saying that. I think it's actually quite a useful insight to stress the way in which drama is about the tragedy of acting in the world, because it shows us what can happen from free action when there aren't firm places from where to start. If you don't know where you start from when you act in the world, you could end up anywhere. And Oedipus never knows where he is. His name means oida, I know, and also I see, and who, where. So every time you hear his name, you're hearing, I don't know where. What's going on? So everything he does is kind of like swimming out into this void in a way. So I think Aristotle's sort of more on the money than Hegel there, who doesn't see these characters as trying to assert a mean, a moderate way of living through demonstrating to the audience the follies of excess. Hegel wants them to be too good to live, in a way. He sees the Antigone as being a collision between the two highest moral powers, arguing, and I quote, that Creon is not a tyrant, he is really a moral power. He is not in the wrong. I think Hegel's in the wrong on this one, because when Creon asks, am I to rule this land for others or myself? His son, Hymen, replies, it's no city at all, owned by one man alone. I think we can see that Hymen is right here. I think an Athenian audience, a democratic body politic, might indeed feel that Creon was in the wrong by burying a young breathing woman alive according to a law he made up yesterday. Something that Creon himself admits and attempts to set right. He says, I in my better judgment have come round to this. I shackled her, I'll set her free myself. I am afraid. It's best to keep the established laws to the very day we die. But he doesn't, of course, and he finds out what the consequences of his actions are pretty quickly. So senseless, so insane. My crimes, my son cut off so young. Ah, dead, lost to the world, not through your stupidity, no, my own. The heartbreaking agony of our lives, and the guilt is all mine, can never be fixed on another man, no escape from me. I killed you, I, God help me, I admit it all. Take me away, quickly, out of sight. I don't even exist. I'm no one. Nothing. And before the supposed reconciliation of the final words of the chorus I quoted earlier, the leader of the chorus tells us, no more prayers now. For mortal men there is no deliverance from the doom we must endure. There's no cozy reconciliation of opposing moral powers here, just the brutal revelation of men in their folly, living life under what Camus called a mass death sentence in the Rebel. There's no escape outside the world, outside history. I bring up Hegel's reading because it's quite easy when you read Greek tragedy to fall into a form of playground Hegelian dialectic, I think. So you go, oh right, there are contesting opposites in Greek thought: reason and tradition, the city and the individual, man and woman, piety and irreverence, law, nomos, and nature, physis, democracy and tyranny, freedom and necessity. And then you say, well, what happens is that these plays dramatize these conflicts, and watching it makes you feel better about yourself. I'm not sure. Those terms are in opposition and conflict, of course, but you can't say that one side of them is sort of more authoritative and gets reaffirmed through being questioned in the play, because the supposed authority of freedom, the city, the citizen, democracy, is entirely provisional in this period. An example of this kind of reading which goes wrong, I think, is Ken Malek's take on Antigone, which I included in the final reading I sent round, where he argues that, again, that Creon was no tyrant, but somebody defending the polis, the city. He quotes Aristotle saying, no citizen should think that he belongs just to himself, and even if the good of the community coincides with that of the individual, it is clearly a greater and more perfect thing to achieve and preserve that of the community. which is to say that Antigone is the bad one here. She's driven by hubris, and at the end of the day, it's all wrapped up nicely because the city-state gets reaffirmed. And that it has to be that way because in 5th century Greek thought, people didn't understand the idea of individual conscience. That's a product of modernity that comes later. I don't think that works simply because Kennedy here has only read half of the play, unfortunately, because what happens? Creon, in defending the values of the city-state, destroys his own family. So he ends up with his wife dead and his son dead. By trying to assert the order of polis, I've made up some laws, this is how it should be, what happens? He destroys his own household. Skip some of this now. I was more convinced, I suppose, by the article by Patrick Marmion, who said that the difference between Creon and Antigone is a matter of faith. His naive faith in the success of his worldly dogmatism, and her faith in an idealism which is undaunted by its final failure. I think they both act in the play, both have faith, both fail. She gets lucky in a way because she tells us something about herself because she demands freedom. She tells us something about being a rebel in her death. If you look at the beginning of that play, you can see, I think, a certain dramatic necessity that unfolds right from the beginning, from the action and the choice that Antigone makes right at the start. Everything flows from that. She makes a choice, and it's not a very convincing choice, actually. She says, I won't give up my dead brother, even if it means losing my husband and the children I will never have with him, because one can always get another husband after all, but there's no chance of getting another brother because my mother and father are dead. So it's not a very convincing choice, but it's a choice of great conviction. Everything that happens after that point is because she is so determined. So she starts in impossibility. That's something her name tells us. Antigone is a denial of birth. She's an impossible woman right from the start. She's also the product, remember, of incest, and she's in love with death. She defies her sister, whom she should love for her dead brother, and she defies her city. She's harsh to her sister, she's self-righteous in her pity and her rush to glorious death. She dismisses her sister's reasoning and pleading as just the excuses of a coward. She's in love, as Ismene says to her, with impossibility itself. Amikanon eras. You love the things without mekane, the things that can't be fixed. Antigone says, no matter, when I have no strength, then I'll stop. Ismene, you are wrong from the start. It is a hopeless quest. You shouldn't start things that you can't finish. Leave me to my absurdity. Whatever I suffer, it won't be to die badly. The word for absurdity is douce bouleia. Boule, heard yesterday, is fate, but it's also a counsel. It's a democratic counsel. It's will and your wish. It can be good reasoning. Antigone wants to be left alone in her bad reasoning, her absurdity. We know then what happens. Everything flows from this decision. Creon suspects treachery, the citizens won't keep their place, Antigone must be crushed, he won't be free if she is, he won't be a man if she gets to play the man, he becomes more and more tyrannical, sentences her to death, heedless of his son's love, demands that Hymen be subordinate to your father's will in every way. He says, show me the man who rules his household well, I'll show you someone fit to rule the state. And he can't do either. He can't rule his house or his state. He ends up being lectured to by a schoolboy, his son, about right and wrong. And the anarchy that he so fears, destroyer of cities and houses, is precisely the product of his very commitment to discipline. And the conflict escalates. Hymen runs from his father to Antigone. She is now a stranger in her own land, always a stranger. I have no home. the result of the coiling horrors of her father's marriage bed, doomed by his action, and the chorus reminds us by her own blind will, your passion has destroyed you. Even love itself, the basic bond of solidarity, is self-destructive. Love, you wrench the minds of the righteous into outrage, swerve them to their ruins. You have ignited this kindred strife, father and son at war, love alone the victor. And the chorus is prepared to rebel as well, takes the side of the democracy against the tyrant and breaks all bands. The chorus laments as Antigone goes voluntarily, although ridden hard by fate, to her death. Denied a wedding, a child, she leaves for the dead alive, for a living death, a law unto herself, for which the word in Greek, of course, is autonomous, self-lord. And I quote this bit in Greek, and I'll translate it. Ala autonomous dosa mone de thneton aidian katabese. She goes down to hell, alone of living beings, alive, self-willing. So here, at this heart of this great tragedy, we have autonomy to the end, a result of her free choice, which started in the worst of origins, in the worst place to start, but a choice unto death nonetheless. Not a necessary choice, but a choice that, once made, binds her in necessity through her own very freedom. An impossible choice, an impossible beginning, but one that she makes regardless. Freedom is very real in this world, but death is a very likely outcome when you act, which is also the tragedy of Socrates' attempt to escape the danger of death that's inherent in political action in a world where authority has no firm basis and tries to escape into philosophy. Okay, so that. A bit more about the futility of man. No towering form of greatness enters into the lives of mortal clear of ruin, etc. Nietzsche wrote a book called The Birth of Tragedy. I think probably should be the other way around. A lot of these stories are the tragedy of births, of being born wrong and starting in the wrong place. Oedipus is a symbol of this. Somebody who tries to go beneath and find a truth beneath appearances, searches for an origin, a foundation, a home for security, wants to know from where he comes, oidapou, but finds only himself in the end, which is sort of the problem. Okay, I'm going to start to wrap up very quickly. I haven't lingered on Antigone because we may not know that one as well as the others, but I haven't given as much space to the other two, but we know I won't talk about Oedipus Charles, let's just discuss that in the discussion. But look at the Colonus, the last play. As I said, this is produced posthumously, and Oedipus goes to Colonus to die in the place where Sophocles, the real man, was born. So there's a certain putting to bed of tragedy in the story of the putting to bed of Oedipus. There's a very poignant reflection on the glories of Athens that have been, but will be as well. I suppose the part of it, is a speech, a few words that Oedipus says to Theseus, most dear to me of strangers, which is a bit of a contradiction there, but a hopeful thing, there's a solidarity there. You and your country, Athenians, and your loyal followers, may you be blessed with greatness, and in your great day, remember me, the dead, the root of all your greatness, everlasting, ever anew. And by taking Oedipus in, Theseus, I think, tries to make him an underpinning authority of Athens, a dead root. Oedipus is refusing to be used as the means of another. He won't be taken back to Thebes. He'll become all use instead. He will, in his death, in his ending, become an end in himself. And you can see it's a bit like he's trying to found a new religion. Athens will be great because of him. Of course, it won't be. We know that. It's just been occupied by 30 tyrants who killed 3,000 Athenian citizens. That's tragic too, as is the goodbye of Oedipus to his children. This is the day that ends your father's life. All that I was on earth is gone. No longer will you bear the heavy burden of caring for your father. It was hard, I know, my children, but one word alone repays you for the labour of your lives. Love, my children. You had love from me as from no man other alive. And now you must live without me all your days to come. Which, I think that's a bit of a tearjerker, and I don't know what effect that had on the audience in sort of ruined Athens at the time, whether they could take that as a hope that they might get it right this time, if they could put an underpinning to the destabilizing effect of the lack of traditional authority. Theseus, his very name means thesmos, an institution, institutionalization personified, but of course that's what Athens didn't have, and we're left there, really, with man trying to justify himself to himself, wondering whether or not action that we take in the world will result in us being remembered like Antigone as heroes, or like Creon as zeros, whether or not by some miracle man in his death can become a source of life. Oedipus says it better than I will, and I'll finish with this when I find it. His final solution to the miracle, I suppose, that allows Oedipus to become his own master, to really be a self-creating creation, to solve his final riddle. So, he asks, so when I am nothing, then am I a man? And is that a bit like Athens' creation, self-creating, never conquered? I'm not sure, but we can probably discuss that.
So your chance to take sides with the fictitious character in Athens. Any questions? I'll take the usual thing, 3 or 4 comments.
It's very interesting. I'm confused actually, because the role of fate in the play seems to be very different. So in Oedipus the king, Oedipus Tyrannus, then fate seems a very central position. So whichever way, which seemingly whatever anybody does in the play, then the effects are fulfilled as a consequence of their actions. Whereas in the Antigone, although Oedipus has been condemned to the 3rd generation, so it's overall it's a fulfillment of fate. As you were saying, it seems more as if their fate, in the sense of what happens to them, is a product of their actions, of their free will actions. And in fact, the free willed actions bring about the consequences.
It's kind of weird because that's where I started when I was reading the plays. But actually, what struck me through what you were talking about is the fate is the fate is the fate. Antigone is going to die. Oedipus is going to find himself. But it's the question of the acts that are done before they find their fate. And you talked about when he says, he's committed a bad act, I am no one, I am nothing. And Antigone has conviction, has a determination, and therefore she lives the good death, or how do you put it? So actually, it seems to me that there's a sense in which there's a discussion about what are good acts and what are bad acts, and you've talked about when you come from a solid place, that you that's when it can happen if you have a solid place to start, and that those characters in the plays who do not have a solid place in which to act, from which to act, are the ones that end up in tragic consequences, and those that do have a solid place to start are the ones that may still meet their fate, but will live a good death, for example.
I was very interested in your question towards the end, whether man and his death can become a source of life, and I think that's quite interesting, because in all of these three plays, death just seems to be a source of more death, endlessly kind of repeated cycles of death. And I was just wondering whether you see any kind of optimism for the future with any of these plays, or whether actually it is just an endless, continuing narrative, but really just more death.
To go in reverse order, yes, certainly, death does seem to breed death, and the living end up looking at all the dead and saying we're responsible for this. I don't think there is any, I don't think there is any sort of easy hope at the moment. There doesn't seem to be any way of stopping this. There is an understanding that life and death are in struggle, freedom and order are in struggle, and when you try and do anything, your actions recoil on you and your family. So the idea of a family curse passed down through 3 or more generations, normally 3 generations, which normally is as far back as you can remember without writing, so that's probably why it's 3. It's there in Herodotus as well, the family curse of the Persian kings is that idea. What does that tell us? It's not that it's fated by the gods. I think I would be fairly confident in saying that they just don't believe in the gods in that way. There is a lot of irreverence to religion. There isn't a strong revealed religion. It can we touched on it yesterday, it can operate as a metaphorical one. But if it's determination from the gods, it's over-determination of what you're doing anyway. The vague, I don't know if it's vague, I suppose the hope in it is that these plays are asking these questions. That there is a search for responsibility. What are the causes of things? Runs through a lot of these plays. And when the cause of things is found, and it is found in the case of Oedipus, he takes responsibility for it in a way, but then of course he then denies that responsibility in the Colonus, where he says, I did these things not willingly, but through ignorance. But even there, he does accept responsibility for them. So, it's I think it, maybe other people can have a go. I think it sort of denies anything other than a waffling answer. It's telling us that both these things happen at the same time, and that whichever foot you shift onto, you're still a bit unstable. But man is at the heart of it, and man asks these questions in these conditions, and has to act anyway. So the fate is fate is fate. It is true that their action is impossible, but unavoidable. Not acting is doing something as well, and people make choices, good and bad ones. But the question that's posed is, with what degree of conviction are they made? So I think with Antigone, She's more sympathetic, more heroic, if you like, because she makes a choice with absolute conviction, and she carries that determination into a living death. She goes alone, self-willing, alive into hell. Creon makes an unconvincing choice equally. Why on earth should you not bury the dead Polynices? I think Tiresias tells him, why are you doing this? Why are you trying to kill the dead twice? I mean, what are you trying to prove? He makes an unconvincing choice without great conviction, because he, at one moment, is arguing with Tiresias, saying, I will never give in, I will be defiant. 2 pages later, he's given in. He said, oh shit, what about that? Quick, get some axes, go and rescue him. So there's something there about courage and determination being an essential part of freedom that may help break out of the vicious circle of fate. And then I suppose the other question is being determined by birth, which does happen, of course, but democracy is a problem or a question mark at the heart of that, because you have the two models of conflict, if you like, of status. You have the unborn tyrant who rules through power of intellect and can rule well. Oedipus is described to us as ruling well and justly for a long time. You can have that power, or you can have an inherited power through birth to your father, Laius. It's interesting in the play that in the Tyrannos, he's called Tyrannos all the time, until right at the end when he finds out that he's the son of Laius. And he then, for one moment, is called Basileus, which is king, which is the older word for a monarch. So he's suddenly in power at the end in Thebes by virtue of his birth, which is a bad birth, which makes him a Basileus with the right to rule that he can't rule. And before he was a tyrant by virtue of his intellect, his good reasoning, ruling well, but doing things that shape the order of the world because his freedom is not constrained, which is the riddle of the Sphinx and the arrows of intellect flying into the air, freely hitting their mark, but doing things with uncontrolled consequences. So you have absolute freedom. Absolutely anything can happen as a result. And so finally, you're born into this condition. So there is a truth in that, a mortal condition that one is born into, and we are determined by our birth in that sense, not in a modern sense of the parents scream, well, I don't know. Oedipus' parents are not very role models.
Fantastic, unique argument for the ineluctability of waffle. Right? So beware when you ask your questions.
You touched a little bit on conscience. I wonder whether you could sort of sounded like you disagree. Well, you definitely disagree with Ken, but you said in passing a point about I think it's a point about there being no conscience. And I wonder if you could say something more on that. Because Antigone, if the story was simply going against authority, then it would be a very different story. Whereas you do get the impression that the story is that she really does have two conflicting loyalties. It's not that she's disloyal to the state. It's not like some modern rebellious, just simply going against authority for the sake of it. It's like Spartacus kind of thing. She really, as far as I can see, does have two really different, two really conflicting pulling loyalties. And then which are the loyalty to follow the law and the loyalty to her family and her brother, and to see him buried and to say his body shouldn't be lying out in the sun being rotted and pecked at by birds. You should have a burial.
Do you see that as a conflict within her? Because she seems not to be worried about breaking the law of the city at all.
No, I'm not worried. This is why I'm saying you see there as a conscience. So I'm saying that, so if the story was simply about breaking the law, then it would be a story about where the laws are there set in stone and unchallengeable. Whereas the story is actually about, well, she's got two possible courses of action according to her loyalty, and she is choosing one of them, which to me implies a conscience. And she's you know, if Luther didn't say it the other day, then maybe she should have done. You know, it does sound like she's saying, I can do no other. You know, because I feel compelled to be pulled in one direction rather than the other. So it does seem like there is this idea of conscience there, and that's the great story, I think, in this expression of freedom, is that you're not, you can choose to follow one or the other. And obviously to make it a good story, you have to present the two choices as really, really big choices, otherwise it wouldn't be a good story. So I just wonder what that would be.
Just to touch on that point about Antigone and the question about whether it can, is it all to do with fate, you know, or did it have to end in tragedy? I mean, I thought that was what was interesting about all three plays, because it kind of raised a lot of questions and may not have answered those questions, but you know, that time in you know, in Greek situation, the fact that it raised. So if you look at Antigone, I thought she was, you know, very brave and was very rebellious and everything else. But from what I read, I thought the law that she wanted to follow was more the law that said, the divine kind of law that said that all the dead had to be buried kind of thing. And that's the thing that kind of hit her most when she was defending or arguing against Priam about burying her brother's body. But then I think it kind of, then the question is raised whether is it really her standing in terms of defending that particular law, or is it much more a kind of a personal stance of being rebellious, because she kind of gives the game away when she makes that thing saying, if it was my husband or my child, I wouldn't particularly do this, you know. So in that, making that statement immediately raises the question that it wasn't perhaps not about this unwritten divine law. It raises another thought in what was she really defending or arguing about? And I don't really think it's been answered in the play, but I think that's the beauty about it, because it kind of brings man to ask all these various questions. And very quickly on Oedipus, it kind of, some of the readings mentions about how he used his mind and skill to solve the mystery. Then when it came to him then, you know, killing his father and marrying his mother, you think when he did go for search the truth, then yes, everybody told him not to, but he did it anyway and found out. Why didn't reason come into his mind to say, well, actually, he didn't know what he was doing then, nor was he conscious that he was marrying his mother, so why can't he stand back by it all and change it, you know, one over again? Now, obviously, that's not the way it was, but the play was. But nevertheless, I think it did raise those questions, which I thought were quite challenging questions at the time.
There's 4 more people to speak. How's it write a new play? I've got everybody here.
One thing that's beginning to become really problematic, I think, over these last couple of days is kind of this idea of freedom. And you know, I think what these tragedies really bring up is that freedom is actually quite a terrifying thing. And with Antigone, I was just reminded of when you said, Angus, about her autonomy to the end and the children ones to death. And it's almost like, and this alludes back to the camp lecture yesterday, sort of when you try and see the moral life, and do you have an almost automatic obligation to it, or do you make a conscious choice? And as you said, she doesn't seem to be troubled by the social law. In a way, it's not even a choice, as I think it's almost a Lutheran concept. So I think going back to the whole question you put at the beginning of why are these plays written by Sophocles, why would all the audience see them, and sort of mention the kind of pat interpretation of catharsis. It just made me think back to Nietzsche and the birth of tragedy and his idea of the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Sort of you have this sort of revelry and sort of, you know, it contains these excesses that we've been talking about of murderous impulses, of rage, of joy. And so is there something like a vicariousness for an audience to have to explore the sort of the dark side of freedom, without necessarily carrying it out, but is it somehow integral, I mean, then as now, to nevertheless witness this in the play?
Two more things. I've seen everybody, but I'll just take you and then Phil.
It was, sorry, it's back to Oedipus, and I think in relation to Hans' question. When Oedipus first learns of his fate, or his fate in this drunken sailor, why doesn't he go and talk to his parents? Or is his belief in the fate so definite, does he think that somehow, if he gets into conversation with his father, will really kill him? Why is there the failure of his own reason or his own questioning? If he later becomes, as a king, such a questioning person, he brings in the soothsayer, demands to know the truth. Even when he first learns of this, why doesn't he follow this up then? And my second question is regarding Creon's interaction with Theseus, where Theseus basically tells Creon to back off and is defending Oedipus. Could this be seen as an example of common customs and common cultures? Is Theseus there as sort of like, the good guy? Is he there as some sort of hero standing up for what is right, what is conventionally correct, or could he be, or is it just sparking off between rival monarchs or rival kings?
We're trying to think about what it is that makes this version, or Sophocles' version of the story or the legends, the one that endures with us. I'm not having read other versions. You mentioned, Discus did one a bit earlier or whatever.
Doesn't survive.
Doesn't survive. But presumably there is some comparative discussion that has taken place. Maybe it was in some of the later readings that I look at. But surely that would draw out, a discussion of the story of the legend, which is predetermined, and the audience knows how it's going to happen. You can't change the ending and give it a nice, cozy ending or whatever. So that is a fixed background to what he's doing, and therefore, if one had the ability to be able to compare with others, it seemed to me what would draw out is the question of the individual, which you've emphasised a lot, the individual courage and antigone, the individual search for truth of Oedipus. That is that which is the distinctive thing, which are obviously eternal, issues, and hopefully not being too influenced by what Frank just said in the last session. But the fight for freedom invites coming across the limits of that freedom, which does seem to be where it is. However much you are being an active, courageous, daring individual, you can't get away from the fact that there are limits to that, and the limits have to be then given by the story, which is the determined tragic ending. So I don't know if you can say more in terms of how this differentiates itself as a version.
I guess I've got see you all.
I love you to take
You'll take some more? That's fine. Well, it'll take you in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, you first.
Cool. What I found most convincing actually is Bernard Knox's reading in the sort of Fables edition that we had. And here's a sort of a humorous reading, which is very much in the zeitgeist, but I think a convincing one. And the idea is that although Oedipus is in this horrible trapped situation, nonetheless the fact that he makes the choice to find out, to seek knowledge, liberates him and makes him, in the end, a hero. He's one of the heroes. He has immortalized himself. Because if you think of the alternative, what if Oedipus hadn't searched for the truth? Thebes would have withered away in a plague. He would have not reckoned with the truth. And that would make him immortal. He would not be immortalized because there's nothing special about him. He would just have led his kingdom to failure. So I think that's important. And what that links up with the rest of what we've been talking about, because we are free to do what we want, but only under circumstances that we inherit. These circumstances might be terrible, but the fact that we do something makes us free. If we do nothing, then that makes us unfree, I think. And that actually brings to mind what Dolan said, because Dolan, quoting Marx in the first lecture for the Academy Scholars, brought the line that Marx said in The Ancient Brumaire, that tradition weighs upon the minds of the living like a nightmare. But the line before that says, men make their own history, not in circumstances they self-select, but in circumstances that they inherit from the past. So we are free to do what we want. It's just that there are certain boundaries, and we accept those boundaries.
Just on that one, just one little bit on the Knox reading. As you say, it's a humanist reading, but I think it's a bit desperate. I think he kind of wants to throw this in because he's finishing an introduction to Oedipus Tyrannus, and it can't be this bleak, can it? What can I find out? Oh, well, he's not free, but he has got the freedom to find out the truth about himself. Well, I just don't find that freedom in the play, actually. His search for himself seems to be entirely necessitated through everything we see in the play. He himself, by his own action, has he's pre-acted himself into this situation, because right at the beginning people come and say, "There's this play, we should do something about it." It's all right, I already have. I've sent off messengers to get prophecies and so on. I've got it all under control, and he's already made the decision to search for himself before he's made it, if you like. He's put himself into a situation in which the way in which the actual drama and the dramatic action unfolds seems to just contain inevitably within it. I mean, it's like he's a machine on the tracks.
Yeah, but then people try and stop him all the time.
One last thing. When he finds out, when he's beginning to find out who he really is, he says, "I must know my birth." Whereas this, like, line 1076, I must let. He says that he wishes for it to happen, but it's disaster that he wishes for. So Jocasta runs off inside. Chorus says, "Where's she gone, Oedipus? Rushing off, such wild grief. I'm afraid that from this silence, something monstrous may come bursting forth. Be born." In Greek. Oedipus, irony, replies, "Let it burst." And it's an imperative. He says, "Let it be born. Whatever will, whatever must. I must know my birth, no matter how common it may be. I must see my origins, his sperm," in Greek, face to face. "I count myself the son of chance. I'll never see myself disgraced. She is my mother. And the moons have marked me out, my blood brothers. One moon on the wane, the next moon great with power. That is my blood, my nature. I will never betray it. Never fail to search and learn my birth." So it becomes difficult to say that reason has led you to find out the origin of your birth. We're being told by Oedipus that his birth leads him to find out the origin of his birth.
All right. With all that image spelling in mind. So,
in Hesiod's Theogony, Zeus kind of becomes king by doing it his father and then placating certain key, female goddesses and things like that. And but obviously he's successful and he establishes order and things. Whereas Oedipus, who seems to sort of reflect very much the Theogony, all goes pear-shaped for him. Obviously Zeus is a god and Oedipus is a mere mortal. I was wondering about the parallels there. And
again, quickly on that, Zeus does a bit more than do his father in. His father is trying to eat him and swallow him, but his mother has hidden him in a cave. He gets out of the cave, gets his father, gets a big sickle used for cutting down crops, and cuts off his father's genitalia. Castrates Cronus and throws his genitalia into the sea, where the foam produces Aphrodite into love. So he leaves his castrated father we don't really know what happens to Cronus, but he's not going to have any more children. We know from the Prometheus band that Zeus is going to have more children, one of whom will be Heracles, who will be greater than him. And there is an ongoing cycle. Zeus may be immortal, but his power is not eternal.
3 more, that's it, 3. Jeremy.
I suppose I'm a bit torn here, trying to make a parallel. I don't know if it really goes anywhere, but I'll say it and you can shoot it down. It struck me that social Darwinists insisted that the attempt to impose a rational order, despite natural law, was doomed to backfire. And I was trying to work out whether that was sort of what was going on here. How much is this what Sophocles feels about the Athenian democratic experiment? Is he saying we must be aware of our irrationality or it's all over? Or is he saying it is going to be all over because what we've done is unlikely to persist because there's a natural order.
I think it's kind of coming up in lots of questions, but I just wanted to explore the point about nothing, that in Athenian democracy, there was a sense in which nothing got handed down by tradition, that there was a disorder and man had to act. But yet, the question of stasis, you made the point that actually each generation couldn't free the next, and that your fate was 3 generations back. And then somebody said, why, when he discovered, when he was searching for his own birth, why didn't he ask his parents? And that his own birth actually caused him to search for his birth. What was the causes of his birth? So in a kind of way, is there a discussion about, nothing gets handed down by tradition, but actually, to a certain extent, there is a structure, there is a tradition. Because if you don't agree that with the point that was made that we're free to act under the circumstances we find ourselves in, which would fit with the idea that one generation can't free the next, but there is an intergenerational conflict, and that it's action of the younger generation that can maybe, from the situation they find themselves in from the previous generation, they're free to act under the circumstances they inherit, then really are you not saying, or is there not a discussion, or am I going on one, that actually, they are bound by their tradition?
Jeff, anybody else burning to speak?
Okay, well, firstly, it's a side issue in the play, but the riddle of the Sphinx, where you have this terrible situation in the city, but if you answer this really kind of stupid riddle, it could be in a Christmas cracker or something, therefore it solves all your problems. I mean, obviously that's a tool in the play, but in wider Greek society, people couldn't have believed things as quite as simplistically that, that's what causes it, and you do something and you solve it. Even if the Delphic Oracle tells you that, that seems particularly crude. So is there anything to say about that? And secondly, I know we've just had the last session, but it is true what Phil says, that the discussion on freedom and its insecurities and limitations does echo some of the things that were said there. And you do have that situation in Greece with the particularities of the coming war with the Peloponnesians, with Sparta, but generally you have an island of, with the demos democracy, very small area, surrounded by a very hostile world in a broader sense, and has been there for 50 years, and is having a number of problems. So you do really have a huge number of insecurities from all angles, and I thought what you were beginning to say about that, and I thought that was quite an interesting way to look at it, and I didn't know if you could take that any further, rather than just say, well, there was a war and therefore there was a particular threat. Within Greek democracy always was, it had a high point after the beat the Persians and all the rest of it, but overall it was a small area of the world, and it was fairly fragile even at the best of times, and it eventually gets swept away. And so it's maybe not surprising that a lot of these themes are very much in the forefront of people's minds.
We can't do it, sorry, last point.
Me?
There's time later on to ask.
Really, I was going to say something similar, but I can't exactly remember when these plays were first performed, but I think it was a failure of democracy during the so-called Peloponnesian War, in that the demos voted incompetently in their prosecution of the war, and I think Athens prosecuted its war quite incompetently, and of course seriously defeated, and that defeat must have been incredible to the Athenian body, because they were riding this crest of a wave of their fantastic democracy. Maybe you could put maybe on that. And their golden boy Alcibiades actually turned traitor and buggered off to Sparta. So there was extreme incompetence. Their fantastic democracy, maybe there was some hubris in Athens, their democracy failed them. Did it? I might be wrong. It seemed to have failed them quite significantly.
Plato's on your side, so I'm not going to say you're immediately wrong.
Well, you've got 10 minutes. Do you want to take those last two questions, or should we just have 10 minutes? We've gone into soft mode, not
It was a really short one. I was just really struck by Jocasta's line about the existence of the gods is up for discussion. It seems something of an aside when I read it, but it seems to have something very profound within it, so I wonder if you have time just to draw that out.
Wendy, very last question.
Oh dear. Well, I suppose it's more kind of comment, because it is that it's amazing how, in a way, the plays do speak to us today and to this discussion. Like this discussion this morning, because on the one hand, there's sort of like, in a way, the only certainty is death. You know, that's almost what it says, that, you know, you will die, this will happen. But within that context, there's sort of like, it's kind of unclear to me about whether we're sort of, what he's driving towards, that we embrace uncertainty in that kind of optimistic spirit that Frank was giving us, or whether we have to fight against it, because there's a sort of, almost what seems to happen in the plays is that the compulsion to act against what seems to be your fate is that expression of the individual in a very, you know, it's both hubristic but also very brave. That you sort of, you don't accept what your fate is. You act within, you act against your fate, and that then is expressed. You know, comes as this sort of. There seems to be a positive expression of individualism within that, in the way, for example, in the character of Antigone, which we talked about. But at the same time, the consequences of that seem to be completely disastrous. So, in relation to society. So it's this thing about, if you act as an individual, you will destroy your society. It's sort of, at the same time, the acting of the individual seems to be presented in positive terms. So it's that kind of constant. I mean, I suspect that Sophocles didn't have answers. He was, you know, in a way exploring as we are. But I mean, that does seem to be the kind of almost inevitable tension within the whole thing.
7 minutes.
Well, there's a famous choral ode in the Antigone, the second one, which it quite often gets a kind of humanist reading of the progressive greatness of man, and it sort of goes, ready, resourceful man, never without resources, never an impasse as he marches on the future. Good. Only death. From death alone he will find no rescue, but from desperate plagues he has plotted his escapes. He continues, man the master, ingenious past all measure, past all dreams, the skills within his grasp he forges on, now to destruction, now again to greatness. When he weaves in the laws of the land and the justice of the gods that binds his oaths together, he and his city rise high, but the city casts out the man who weds himself to inhumanity thanks to reckless daring. Never share my hearth, never think my thoughts, whoever does such things. So yeah, there's a certain amount of ambiguity about what will happen, but we're told that reckless daring is the problem that can lead to the high city, Sophocles, becoming a polis, thrown out of the city. You're not fit to be a citizen if you give in to reckless daring. So the question here is, how can you act prudently? So a lot of the time the question is being asked, how can you reason well and not be excessive? And the possibility of reasoning well is certainly accepted, at least at a theoretical level. But it's posed, I think, only as a question, and that's why this is the tragedy. Freedom is only posed as a question. It's its own question. Freedom presents itself to man as its own question. So there is a necessity in that freedom to just go and try and answer that question. But if we're to avoid tragedy and break this cycle, then we have to find a way of being daring without being reckless, i.e. acting but not recklessly. And the problem is that every time we act, it seems to be imprudent, that our action is blind, which Oedipus symbolises. How do we come to an end of that question? Partly I'm going to try and answer that one tomorrow, because the answer to the question of how to act freely but not imprudently is history. And through understanding history to a degree, we can learn from the past, and in thinking about our past, we may then sometimes be able to have a bit of an impact on our future. But that's for tomorrow. Forgive me. The defeat in the war and the imprudent decisions that are made. I mentioned Plato because partly that understanding is a later understanding by people of a more conservative bent than the Athenian democracy. The later understanding of what went wrong given to us by people like Plato and Aristotle, Xenophon, the old oligarch, a number of writers who theorized what went wrong in the lack of expertise in a democracy. So of course the decisions taken were incompetent because you had councils and assemblies with cobblers in them, and common people who work in shops. No wonder they make terrible decisions. We can't possibly have that kind of thing again. And that reaction actually takes the form, I will talk about this tomorrow again, in an assertion of nature against law. So the argument becomes that there are certain people in society who are by birth better equipped to rule than others. They're better looking, they've got better brains, they've got leisure and money that allow them to do the sort of thinking about what might happen that would result in wise decisions and not the rash sort of decisions democracies full of cobblers make. So that is a reaction made in the name of nature against custom, because this is the whole problem is you get a bunch of people together and they vote on what law should be, in the same way the Creole just makes up the law, and then look what happens if you just make up the law. How do you that whole process of what sets a tradition that can last for more than one day is a question that's being asked at the same time. In terms of solving the riddle, Jeff, I mean, I think it's not, I mean, it is a Christmas cracker, of course, but the sort of, one way of thinking about it is Oedipus gets the answer wrong, because he says, what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 at night. Oh, I know, it's man. And I'm able to abstract myself away. I think Saxon House argues this in the article on it. I can extract myself away because I'm sort of pure reason, and I can count and work this out. But because I've forgotten the reality of my own birth, I can see this answer to this question. But when he says the answer is man, he's probably wrong, isn't it, in a way, because the answer is that you die equally, because it's a process that ends up. So it may not be quite as simple as that, but again, the whole thing is being riddled through that idea of what binds the generations. There's a little story in Cicero that Sophocles himself might have been a victim of this intergenerational conflict. Cicero says that Sophocles composed tragedies to extreme old age, 90 or so, and being believed to neglect the care of his property owing to his devotion to his art, his sons brought him into court to get a judicial decision depriving him of the management of his property on the grounds of weak intellect. Thereupon the old poet is said to have read to the judges the play he had just written and had composed, the Oedipus Colonus, and to have asked them whether or not they thought that the work of a man of weak intellect. And after the reading, he was acquitted by the jury. I don't know if that happened or not, but it's one of those things that should have done, even if it didn't. Phil, couple actually. Phil, in terms of comparing to other plays, these ones are a little bit unique. They don't compare very well to, say, the Horus Diet, but they do compare quite well to Herodotus. We can look at that tomorrow, and I think they were kind of pally. Sophocles and Herodotus. I mention that because I read them as being in the democratic tradition of Athenian thinking and not in the later reaction against it. So I think Sophocles and Herodotus are on one side, Euripides and Thucydides express a conservative reaction in the name of realism. One of the things that's always noted about Euripides is that, we like Euripides, he's very, very modern and realistic. Realism is to come down, in this case, is to come down on the side of nature against the idealism of forming customs and creating laws, which is something that democracy does, but again, destabilizing. Cronin, why doesn't he ask his parents? I think because he can't see his parents because he's going to kill them. So the whole story is...
So he accepts his fate, absolutely.
He runs from his fate to his fate, and we're told that explicitly. He hears the story of the drunk, and he says, "You're going to kill your mother and your father." And he says, "The last thing I want to do is kill my mother and my father. I better run from them and never see them again." And where does he run to? Etc. Theseus defends Odysseus. Oedipus. Why? I think it's to show us the possibility of love in a way, and the possibility in the end, albeit even in death, of a relationship or friendship that is unnatural, that they don't have any real reason to love each other, but it becomes possible probably because of who Oedipus is. Last thoughts. I'm not sorry if I haven't got all the questions, but in terms of the individual conscience one, which I think is interesting, whether or not we can see that in Antigone at the time. I think in the lecture on Frank did give a bit of a get-out clause for literature to have insights into the human condition before they get realised in politics or in a wider social scale. I would claim that kind of get-out clause for this as great literature, but also supported by saying that there is an out-of-time character to the Athenian experiment, that just because of what it is, it sort of arrives unborn, because there's never been democracy before, and it happens sort of by accident, and then you're into this situation that you don't really ever, when you look behind you for the reasons, find them there. Freedom has not become its own tradition. Arguably, it has still not become its own tradition, and in that sense, that may be why we find the ancient Greeks still amenable to giving some sort of answers or questions. We still find it enjoyable and useful to read them, that we can recognize ourselves in some of their concerns, not because there is necessarily a eternal, universal, underlying human nature, but because some of the historical conditions they were in and the absence of a authoritative tradition throw up some of the same ideas and questions that we face today. And one of those is to go back to the Kant thing, the incommensurability often of your interior subjectivity with the reality of the external world. So your idealized internal self is thrown into an external world which is messy. And when you have a French Revolution, which is launched under the banners of idealism, quite quickly things get messy, and you want a perspective, a later perspective of history to judge on that. Athens, right at the very beginning, I suppose, didn't have the time to make that possible, but all the better for us in a way, because some of their problems may be our own, though not to be too tragic about it, they might have been in a bit more of a positive situation than we are, because they were in a situation where freedom certainly existed but ran up against necessity. We seem to be in a situation where we freely demand for our freedom to be restrained by necessity, because we're even more concerned about the consequences of imprudent action than the Athenians might be.
Freedom is restrained by liberty. Thank you. Yes.